Chapter 8. The day hunting season opened, I was as nervous as Sammy, our house cat. Part of that seemingly endless day was spent getting things ready for the coming night. I cleaned my lantern and filled it full of oil. With hog lard, I greased my boots until they were as soft as a hummingbird's nest, and I was grinding my axe when Pa came around. He smiled as he said, "This is the big night, isn't it?" "It sure is, Pa, and I've been waiting a long time for this." "Yeah, I know. I've been thinking. There's not too much to do around here during hunting season. I'm pretty sure I can take care of things, so you just go ahead and hunt all you want to." "Thanks, Pa. I guess I'll be out pretty late at night, and I probably will have to do a lot of sleeping in the daytime." Pa frowned. "You know," he said, "your mother doesn't like this hunting of yours very much. She's worried about you being out all by yourself." "Well, I can't see why Ma has to worry. Haven't I been roaming the woods ever since I was big enough to walk, and I'm almost 14 now?" "I know. It's all right with me, but women are just a little different than men. They tend to worry a bit more. Now, just to be on the safe side, I think it'd be a good idea for you to tell us where you'll be hunting. Then, if anything happens, we'll know where to look." I told him I would, but I didn't think anything was going to be happening. After Pa had left, I started thinking. He doesn't even talk to me like I was a boy anymore. He's talking like I was a man. Those wonderful thoughts made me feel just as big as our old red mule. Well, I had a good talk with my dogs. "I've waited almost 3 years for this night, and it hasn't been easy. I've taught you everything I know, and I want you to do your best." Little Ann acted like she understood. She whined and saved me a good washing job on my face. Old Dan might have, but he didn't act that way. He just lay there in the sunshine, all stretched out and limber as a rag. During supper, Ma asked me where I was going to hunt. "I'm not going far. I think I'll just go down the river a little ways." I could tell Ma was worried, and it didn't make me feel too good. "Billy, I don't approve of this hunting, but it looks like I can't say no. Not after all you've been through getting your dogs and all that training." "Aw, he'll be all right. Besides, he's getting to be a good-sized man now." "Man? Why, he's still just a little boy." "Oh, you can't keep him a little boy always. He's got to grow up someday." "Oh, I know, but I don't like it, not at all, and I can't help worrying." "Please, Ma, don't worry about me," I said. "I'll be all right. Why, I've been all over those hills, you know that." "Oh, I know, but that was in the daylight. I never worry too much when it's daylight, but at night, that's different. It'll be dark and anything can happen." "There won't be anything happening. I promise I'll be careful, Ma." Ma got up from the table and saying, "Well, it's like I say, I can't say no, and, well, I can't help but worry. I'll pray every night you're out." The way Ma had me feeling, I didn't know whether to go hunting or not. Pa must have sensed how I felt. "It's getting dark now, and I understand those coons, they start stirring pretty early. You better get going, hadn't you?" While Ma was bundling me up, Pa lit my lantern. He handed it to me, saying, "I'd like to see a big coonskin on that smokehouse wall in the morning." The whole family followed me out onto the porch, and there we all got a surprise. My dogs were sitting on the steps and just waiting for me. I heard Pa laugh. "Well, they know what you're going hunting for. Know as well as anyone." "Well, I never. Do you really think they do? It sure looks like it. Why, just look at them," Ma said. Little Ann started wiggling and twisting. Old Dan trotted out to the gate and stopped and turned around and looked at me. "Sure they know Billy's going hunting," piped up a little one. "And I know why." "And how do you know that, silly?" asked the oldest. Because I told little Ann, that's why. And then she told old Dan, and that's how they know. Well, we all got a good laugh at that. The last thing I heard as I left the house was the voice of my mother. Be careful, Billy, and don't stay out late. It was a beautiful night, still and frosty. A big grinning Ozark moon had the countryside bathing in a soft yellow glow. The starlit heaven reminded me of a large blue umbrella outspread with the handle broken off. Just before I reached the timber, I called the dogs to me. Now the trail's going to be a little different tonight, I whispered. It won't be a hide dragged on the ground. It'll be the real thing, so you just remember everything I taught you, and I'm depending on you. You just put one up a tree, and I'll do the rest. I turned them loose, saying, Go get 'em! They streaked for the timber. By the time I had reached the river, every nerve of my body was drawn up tight as a fiddle string. Big-eyed, ears open, I walked on, stopping now and then to listen. The way I was slipping along, anyone would have thought I was trying to slip up on a coon myself. I'd never seen a night so peaceful and still. All around me, tall sycamores gleamed like white steamers on a moonlight. A prowling skunk came wobbling up the river bank, and he stopped when he saw me. I smiled at the fox flare glow of his small, beady red eyes. He turned and disappeared into the underbrush. I heard a sharp snap and a feathery rustle in some brush nearby, and a small rodent started squealing in agony. A nighthawk must have found his supper. Across the river and from far back into the rugged mountains I had heard the baying of a hound. I wondered if it was the same one I had heard from my window all those nights ago. Although my eyes were seeing the wonders of the night, my ears were ever alert, listening for the sound of my hounds telling me they had found a trail. I was expecting one of them to bawl, but when it came, it startled me. The deep tones of old Dan's voice jarred the silence around me, and I dropped my axe and almost dropped my lantern. A strange feeling came over me. I took a deep breath and threw back my head to give the call of the hunter, but something was wrong. My throat felt like it had been tied into a knot, and I swallowed a couple of times, and the knot disappeared, and as loud as I could, I whooped, Woo-wee! Get 'em, Dan! Go get 'em! Little Ann came in. The bell-like tones of her voice sent shivers up and down my spine, and I gave a whoop at her. Woo-wee! Tell him, little girl! Tell him to get 'em! This is what I had prayed for, worked and sweated for, my own little hounds bawling at the trail of a river coon. I don't know why I cried, but I did. While the tears rolled, I whooped again and again. They started the trail out and headed down the river. Well, I took off after them as fast as I could run. A mile downstream, the coon pulled his first trick. Well, I could tell in my dogs' voices that they had lost the trail, and when I came up to them, they were out on the old drift, sniffing around. The coon had pulled a simple trick. He'd run out onto a drift and leapt into the water and then crossed the river. To an experienced coon hound, the crude trick would have been nothing at all, but my dogs were just big awkward pups, trailing their first live coon. I stood and watched, wondered if they would remember the training I'd given them. Now and then I'd whoop and urge them on. Old Dan was having himself a fit. He whined and he bawled and he whimpered and cried, and he came to me and reared up begging for help. I'm not going to help you, and you're not going to find him on that drift. If you just remember some of that training I gave you, you'd find that trail. Now you go get that coon. He ran back out on the drift and started searching. Little Ann came to me. I could see the pleading in her warm gray eyes. I'm ashamed of you, little girl. I thought you had more sense than this. If you let him fool you so easily, you'll never be a coon dog. She whined and turned and trotted downstream, searching for the lost trail. I couldn't understand. Had all the training I'd given them been useless? I knew if I waded the river, they'd follow me, and then once on the other side, it'd be easy for them to find the trail, and I didn't want it that way. I wanted them to figure it out by themselves. The more I thought about it, the more disgusted I became. I sat down and buried my face in my arms. Out on the drift, old Dan started whimpering and whining. It made me angry, and I got up to scold him again. I couldn't understand his actions. He was running along the edge of the drift, whimpering and starting downstream. I looked that way, and I could see something swimming in the opposite direction. At first I thought it was a muskrat. In the middle of the stream, where the moonlight was the brightest, I got a good look. It was little Ann. With a loud whoop, I told her how proud I was of her. My little girl was remembering her training. She came out onto the gravel bar and shook the water from her body and then disappeared into the thick timber. Minutes later, she let me know she had found the trail. And before the tones of her voice were died away, old Dan plowed into the water. He was so eager to join her, I could hear him whining as he swam. As soon as his feet touched bottom on the shallows, he started bawling and lunging. White sheets of water, knocked high in the moonlight by his churning feet, gleamed like thousands of tiny little stars. He came out of the river onto a sandbar, and in his eagerness his feet slipped in the loose sand and down he went. He came out of his roll, running and bawling, and ahead of him was a log jam. Well, he sailed over it and then disappeared down the river bank. Seconds later, I heard his deep voice blending with the sharp cries of little Ann. At that moment, no boy in the world could have been more proud of his dogs than I was. Never again would I doubt them. I was hurrying along, looking for a shallow riff so I could wade across when the voices of my dogs stopped. I waited and listened. They came again on my side of the stream. The coon had crossed back over. Well, I couldn't help smiling. I knew that never again would a ringtail fool them by swimming the river. The next trick the old fellow pulled was a dandy. He climbed a large white water oak standing about 10 feet from the river and then simply disappeared. I got there in time to see my dogs swimming for the opposite shore, and for half an hour they worked that bank not finding the trail, and they'd swim back. I stood there watching them. They practically tore the river bank to pieces looking for the trail. Old Dan knew the coon had climbed the water oak, and he went back, reared up on it, and bawled a few times. "No use in doing that, boy. I know he climbed it, but he's not there now. Maybe it's like Grandpa said, he just climbed right out onto the top and then disappeared into the stars." My dogs didn't know it, but I was pretty well convinced that that was what the coon had done. They wouldn't give up, and once again they crossed over to the other shore. It was no use. The coon hadn't touched that bank, and they came back. Old Dan went up the river, and little Ann worked downstream. An hour and a half later, they gave up and came to me begging for help. I knelt down between their wet bodies, and while scratching and petting them, I let them know that I still loved them. "I'm not mad. I know you did your best. If that coon can fool both of us, then we're just beat. We'll go somewhere else to hunt. He's not the only coon in these bottoms." Just as I picked up my axe and lantern, little Ann let out a bawl and tore off down the river bank. Old Dan, with a bewildered look on his face, stood for a moment looking after her, and then he raised his head high in the air and let my eardrums ring with his deep voice. I could hear the underbrush popping as he ran to join her. I couldn't figure out what had taken place. Surely little Ann had heard or seen something. I could tell by their voices that whatever there was after, they were close enough to see it and were probably running by sight. The animal left the bottoms and headed for the mountains, and whatever it was, it must have realized my dogs were crowding it too close. And at the edge of the foothills it turned and came back to the river. I was still trying to figure out what was going on when I realized that on striking the river, the animal would again turn and be coming straight towards me. I set my lantern down and tightened my grip on the axe. I was standing my ground quite well when visions of bears and lions and all kinds of other critters started flashing across my mind. I jumped back behind a big sycamore and was trying to press my body into the tree when a big coon came tearing by. 25 yards behind them were my dogs running side by each, and I saw them clearly when they passed me, bawling every time their feet touched the ground. After seeing that there was nothing to be scared of, once again I was the fearless hunter, screaming and yelling as loud as I could, "Get 'em, boy, get 'em!" Well, I took out after them. The trails I knew so well were forgotten. I took off straight through the brush. I was tearing my way through some elders when I heard the voices of my dogs stop. Holding my breath, I stood still and waited. And then it came. The long, drawn-out bawl of a tree bark. My little hounds had done it. They had treed their first coon. When I came to them and saw what they had done, I was speechless. I groaned and closed my eyes. I didn't want to believe it. There were a lot of big sycamores in the bottom, but this one, which my dogs had treed, was the giant of them all. While prowling the woods, I had seen the big tree many a time, and I'd always stopped and admired it. Like a king in his own domain, it towered far above the smaller trees. It had taken me quite a while to find a name suitable for that big sycamore, and for a while I'd called it the chicken tree. In some ways it reminded me of a mother hen hovering over her young in the rainstorm. Its huge limbs spread out over the small birch and ash and box elder and water oak, as if it alone was their protector. Next, I named it the giant. That name didn't last long. Ma told us children a story about a big giant that lived in the mountains and ate little children that were lost. Right away, I started looking for another name. One day, while lying out in the warm sun staring at that magnificent beauty, I found the perfect name, and from that day on, it was called the Big Tree. I named the bottoms around it the Big Tree Bottoms. Walking around it and using the moon as a light, I started looking for a coon. High up in the top, I saw a hollow in the end of a broken limb. I figured that would be the coon's den. I could climb almost any tree I'd ever seen, but I knew I could never climb that big sycamore, and it would take days to chop down. There had been very little hope from the beginning, but on seeing that hollow, I gave up. "Come on, dogs. There's nothing I can do. We'll go someplace else and find another coon." I turned to walk away, and my hounds made no move to follow. They started whining. Old Dan reared up and placed his front paws in the trunk and started bawling. "I know he's there, but there's nothing I can do. I can't climb it. It's 60 feet up to the first limb, and it would take me a month to cut it down." Again I turned and started on my way. Little Ann came with me. She reared up and started licking my hands and swallowing the knot in my throat. I said, "I'm sorry, little girl. I want him just as badly as you, but there's no way I can get him." She ran back to the tree and started digging in the soft ground close to the roots. "Come on now," I said in a gruff voice. "You're both acting silly. You know I'd get that coon for you if I could, but I can't." With a whipped dog look on her face and with her tail betwixt her legs, little Ann came over. She wouldn't even look at me. Old Dan walked slowly around behind the tree and hid himself. He peeped around the big trunk and looked at me. The message I read in his friendly eyes tore at my heart. He seemed to be saying, "You told us to put one in a tree and you'd do the rest." With tears in my eyes, I looked again at that big sycamore. A wave of anger came over me and grit my teeth. I said, "I don't care how big you are. I'm not going to be letting my dogs down. I told them if they put a coon in a tree, I'd do the rest, and I'm gonna cut you down. I don't care if it takes me a whole year." I walked over and sank my axe as deep as I could into the smooth white bark. Well, my dogs threw a fit. Little Ann started turning in circles, and I could hear her pleased whimpering cry, and old Dan bawled and started gnawing at the big tree's trunk. Well, at first it was easy. My axe was sharp and the chips flew. Well, 2 hours later, things were a bit different. My arms felt like two dead grapevines, and my back felt like somebody was pulling the plug out of one end and drained out all the sap. While taking a breather, I saw I was making more progress than I thought I would. The cut I had started was a foot deep, but I certainly had a long ways to go. Sitting on their rears, my dogs waited and watched. I smiled at the look on their faces. Every time I stopped chopping, they'd come over. And while little Ann washed the sweat from my face, old Dan would inspect my work. He seemed pleased with what he saw, for he was always wagging his tail. Along about daylight, I got my second wind, and I really did make some chips fly, and this burst of energy cost me dearly. By sunup I was so stiff I could hardly move. My hands and arms were numb, my back screamed with pain, and I couldn't go no further. Sitting down, I leaned back against the big tree and fell asleep. Little Ann woke me up by washing my face. I groaned with the torture of getting to my feet. Every muscle in my body seemed to be tied into a knot. I was thinking of going on down to the river to wash my face in the cool water when I heard a loud whoop. I recognized my father's voice. I whooped to let him know where I was. Pa was riding our red mule. After he rode up, he just sat there and looked me over. He glanced at my dogs and at that big sycamore. I saw the worry leave his face. He straightened his shoulders and pursed his lips and blew out a little air. He reminded me of someone who had just dropped a heavy load. In a slow, calm voice, he asked, "Are you all right, Billy?" "Yes, Pa. Only I'm a little tired and sleepy. Otherwise, I'm fine." He slid from the mother's back and came over. "Your mother's worried. When you didn't come in, we didn't know what had happened. You ought to have come home." I didn't know what to say. I just bowed my head and looked at the ground. I was trying hard to choke back the tears when I felt his hand on my shoulder. "I'm not scolding," he said. "We just thought maybe you'd had an accident or something." I looked up and saw a grin on his face. He turned and looked again at the tree. "This is the sycamore you call the big tree, isn't it?" I nodded. "Is that coon in there?" he asked. "He sure is, Pa. He's in that hollow limb. See that one way up there? That's why I couldn't come home. I was afraid he'd get away." "Maybe you just think he's there. I believe I'd make sure before I cut down a tree that big." "He's there, all right. My dogs weren't 10 feet behind him when he went up it." "Why are you so determined to get this particular coon? Couldn't you just go somewhere else and tree one there? Maybe the tree would be a bit smaller." "I thought about that, Pa, but I made a bargain with my dogs. I told them that if they put one up a tree, I'd do the rest. Well, they fulfilled their part of the bargain, and now it's up to me to do my part. And I'm gonna, Pa. I'm gonna cut it down. I don't care if it takes me a year." Pa laughed and said, "Well, I don't think it'll take that long, but it will take a while. I'll tell you what I'll do. You take the mule and go back and get some breakfast. I'll chop on it until you get back." "No, Pa. I don't want any help. I want to cut it down all by myself. You see, if someone helps me, I wouldn't feel like I kept up my part of the agreement." An astonished look came over my father's face. "Why, Billy, you can't stay down here without anything to eat or no sleep. Besides, it'll take at least 2 days to cut that tree down, and that's hard work." "Please, Pa, don't make me quit. I just want to get that coon, and if I don't, my dogs won't ever believe in me again." Pa didn't know what to tell me. He scratched his head and looked over at my dogs and back at me, and he started walking around. I waited for him to make up his mind, and then finally he reached a decision. "Well, all right. If that's the way you want it, I'm for it, even if it's only an agreement betwixt you and your dogs. If a man's word isn't any good, he's no good himself. Now I have to get back and tell your ma that you're all right. It's a cinch that you can't do that kind of work on an empty stomach, so I'll send your oldest sister back with a lunch bucket." With tears in my eyes, I said, "Can you tell Ma I'm sorry for not coming home last night?" "Oh, don't you worry about your mother," he said, as he climbed onto the mule's back. I'll take care of her. Another thing, I have to make a trip into the store today, and I'll talk this over with your grandfather. He might be able to help in some way. After Pa left, things were a little different. The tree didn't look quite as big. My axe wasn't quite as heavy. I even managed to sing a little as I chopped away. And when my sister came with the lunch bucket, I could have kissed her, but I didn't. She took one look at that big tree, and her blue eyes got as big as a guinea's egg. "You're crazy," she gasped. "Absolutely crazy. Why, it'll take a month to cut that tree down. All over an old coon?" I was so busy with the fresh side pork and fried eggs and hot biscuits I didn't pay much attention to her. After all, she was a girl, and girls don't think like boys do. Well, she went raving on. "You can't possibly cut it down today. And what are you going to do when it does get dark?" "Well, I'll just keep right on chopping," I said. "I stayed with it all last night, didn't I? Well, I'll stay till it's cut down. I don't care how long it takes me." Well, my sister, she got a little upset, and she looked at me, threw back her small head, and looked up at the top of the big sycamore. "You're as crazy as a bedbug. I never heard of such a thing." She stepped over in front of me and very seriously asked if she could look in my eyes. "What do you want to look in my eyes for? Want to make sure I'm not sick?" "Yes, you are, Billy. Very sick. Ma said when old man Johnson went crazy, his eyes turned green. I want to see if yours have." Well, this was too much. "If you don't get out of here, you're going to be red instead of green, and I mean that." I picked up a stick and started towards her. Of course, I wouldn't have hit her for anything, but this scared her, and she started for home. I heard her say something about an old coon as she disappeared into the underbrush. Down in the bottom of my lunch bucket, I found a neat little package of scraps for my dogs. And while they're eating, I walked down to the spring and filled the bucket with cool water. The food did wonders for me. My strength came back. I spit on my hands and whistled the coon hunter's tune, and I started making the chips fly. The cut grew so big I could have laid down in it, and I moved over to one side and started a new one. Once, while I was taking a rest, old Dan came over and inspected my work. He hopped up in the cut, sniffed all around. "You better get out of there. If that tree takes a notion to topple, it'll mash you flatter than a tadpole's tail." With a no-care look on his friendly face, he gave me a hurry-up signal with the wag of his tail. Little Ann had dug a bed into a pile of dead leaves, and she looked as if she was asleep, but I knew she wasn't. Every time I stopped swinging the axe, she'd raise her head and look at me. End of chapter 8.